we're going to continue this afternoon with a panel discussion in which we get to have many of your answers, many of your questions, get some responses to. I don't know if they'll be answered, but you'll certainly get some responses to many of them. Sue and I tried to group them together into some kind of logic, so you won't necessarily see your exact question being given, but you'll see something hopefully related to one of the questions that you gave. I have two important announcements. One is, when you leave this afternoon, you do not have to worry about any kind of exit parking ticket. You can just leave. The gates open, you can just leave. The other thing, and since we're saving you all that time, I'm really going to encourage you to fill out your evaluation form and turn in your evaluation form. And you, when you return, hand in your evaluation form, it's just at the desk where you're registered at. So please hand in your evaluation form at the registration desk. And just in closing, because I know at the end it's going to be kind of rushed, so I actually want to close by, again, thanking everybody, particularly all the workers that were here. You know, they were always the one that go unapplauded for, right? They work behind the scenes, they work at the tables. They were here actually before 7 o'clock this morning. Can you imagine that? They were here before many of us. So I think that all the workers that were here, I'm not going to be able to name them, but many of them come from Barbara's office, the Office of Outreach for the Michigan State College of Education, as well as Cramer. I think that they really deserve a big applause from all of us. So with that, we're going to get started with our panel. The way this is set out is that we're going to begin by each one of the panel members first beginning to say something, not really long, but something very short on their list. So rather than me introducing each one of them, I'd like for them to start off and say who they are and who they're representing, and then give their little statement, and then we'll continue with the question. Okay? So we're going to begin, and there's an order though. So we're going to first begin with Stephen Pruitt. Stephen, you already have met this morning, so he doesn't have to give much of an introduction. So Stephen, it's you.
I was going to introduce myself as Joe Krajcik, but since you already introduced me again, I guess I won't do that. My statement is just wow. This has been such a great day. It's to see the professionalism, to see the engagement. You've asked some great questions today. You've been incredibly engaged. And so I guess the part that I would like to just start with is just a little bit of a soapbox thing for me. And that is that we can't underestimate the value or importance of a teacher voice. You guys are where the proverbial rubber meets the road. And you guys are the ones who are going to have to ultimately carry through on what's best for kids. We know what happens once politicians get involved, and it's about you guys. And so you need, the biggest pet peeve I have with our profession is that we forget we're a profession. And we need to step up to the plate and be that. And I believe that you being at this meeting today and you being engaged like you have is evidence of the professionalism that you guys have. The second thing I would say, just very briefly, is I'm going to reiterate something I said earlier. Courage to be patient. I heard a lot of conversation today about the way things are now. Well, the whole point is they are the way they are now because it's now. Okay? And it's the reality. It's the way it is now. There are levers. Adopting standards, should Michigan choose to adopt, that's the first step. It's like Jim Lovell said in Apollo 13, there are 100 things to do and we're on number 6. And so have the courage to be patient. Use your teacher voice. And the other thing is, in that same vein, while the optimists and pessimists are arguing about the glass of water, just pick it up and drink it. Okay, be the opportunist and realize that this is going to take a while. Realize that this implementation is something that's going to be slow and deliberate, and be ready. Pick one thing that you think you can do great next year and do it. But don't try to do everything all at once. But rather than sitting and thinking about all the things that could go wrong, because trust me, lots of things could go wrong. Think about those kids and how we can actually make this happen from a vision of science education that will help our kids in the 21st century. So I just really thank you for giving me the chance to be here today. I really appreciate the kind words, and those of you who actually braved listened to me more than once. You can hear this voice for more than once. It's really, I always appreciate people like that. But you guys have done a great job here, and this is literally, and I'm not saying this because I'm here, it's literally one of the best events I've attended in the last year, and I just really appreciate being able to be here.
So then we're going to pass this over to Linda Forward, who is the Director of the Office of School Improvement for the Michigan Department of Education.
Thanks, Joe. First of all, our office is the one that houses the unit for curriculum and instruction, as well as educational technology, and then a couple of other things that we do just along the way. And I want to first of all say thank you, Joe, to you and to Barb Markle and MSU for having the vision to put this out for teachers to have in their hands at this point in time. Adopted or not, it gives you a vision of where we want to go and what we'd like to see happen in the state. And adopted or not, you have all of those practices which would yield up some really good science education as you think about what you might want to do next year in your classrooms without changing standards one bit as far as content. I also want to thank the internal committee who worked so hard on helping us get the standards to this point in Michigan. And you know who you are, I'm not going to name names, but I just want to thank you. It was a lot of extra work that team did to put together guidance and advice for Stephen and his team on what would we hope yield up some good standards. Having said that, just to let you know where we are on the pathway to adoption, we have some things that we have to get from Stephen's shop, and we have some analyses that have to be done in order to answer some questions for the state board. We, once we can get that work done, we will be taking forward the standards for their approval. They have been presented to them. They were favorably impressed with them at the time. I think one of the nicest balances that we have on our state board is that some of the folks that you might think ideologically would be opposed are not, in fact, are deeply involved in science education across the state and have been in meetings where Stephen and Joe and Barb and the rest of us were present. And so I think that there's great promise for the future. I just can't give you a date right now. I take a look at those practices and start there, and we'll see where we can roll the rest of it out.
We're going to move in to Sue Codere.
Thank you. We're really excited that we're this far in the process. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that this is still just the beginning. So it seems like a long time. For the last 2 years, we've been working on helping to develop the standards. But now we're in the beginning, and we have lots of partners that we're working with, and we're so thankful to have those. So you heard today already about the Mass Science Centers and the Michigan Science Teachers Association. We have developed a very strong partnership with the Career for STEM Institute, as you can imagine, after seeing what we've pulled off today. We have other higher ed partners, and many of them were here today, and their colleagues are all interested in getting on board. We have a partnership with Michigan Virtual University. We work very closely with the ISDs and the RISAs, and through MESA, their administrative organization. And we have a lot of work being done with our lead state partners and with non-lead states through the building capacity for science education, through other organizations that we're working with. So we have a good plan for continued support for the NGSS, and we thought that perhaps today we'd be able to show you some kind of transition plan, but because they aren't adopted, we didn't do that. But trust me that your colleagues have been active participants in helping to build these partnerships and relationships, and we've got very strong support for helping to support you when you try to implement these. We need to get them adopted. Thanks.
We're going to move on to Megan.
Hello, I'm Megan Schrauben from the Michigan Department of Education, and I'm the Integrated Education Consultant in the Office of Education Improvement and Instruction. And just wanted you to know that we are working on an innovative professional development model through a pilot process called the Next Generation Science Exemplar Project. And based on research that's been going on in education for years, in fact, some of it's Joe's research that's in there, and we hope that this will become a model that we can use across our state to work with teachers and administrators in the new vision of the standards.
Then we're going to go on to Robby.
Hi, I'm Robby Cramer. I'm the Executive Director of the Michigan Science Teachers Association. Both the Michigan Science Teachers Association and the Michigan Math and Science Center Network stand ready to support the Michigan Department of Education to support the adoption and the implementation of the next generation science standards. MSTA is prepared to focus our state conference next spring, presenting resources and materials and suggestions and ideas for teachers on implementation for next gen, the practices, as well as the cross-cutting concepts and core ideas. We are committed to facilitating regional workshops with a next gen focus.
Larry?
Good afternoon. It's great that you stayed. As Director of the Math Science Center Network, I want to perhaps leave a little bit of the anxiety by saying that we've been involved in conversation with MDE and with many of our other constituents across the state, including Robby and the MSTA, in regards to trying to figure out the best way to help you folks start implementing this in the classroom. I might also let you know that we're also working quite closely with several of the CTE people. In fact, we had Patty Cantu at our last network meeting for the network, and we are trying to work in coordination with our career and tech ed people in regards, again, to implementing the next generation science standards in the classroom.
Ian?
Hi, I'm Andy Middlestead. I'm the Test Development Manager in the Office of Standards and Assessment in the Department of Education. And I'm excited to be here, and this is very exciting stuff for science. I would say I appreciate some of Stephen's comments about needing to have courage and be patient. Anytime you approach one of these types of conversions or new standards, the first question that gets asked is, what's the test going to look like? We don't know that yet, so using another one of Stephen's analogies, if we're on step 6 right now, what the test looks like is about step 75. So, we will get there. If these standards are adopted by the state board, I can say that I know our office, in collaboration with Linda's office, are going to be ready to step into quick action to start looking at what we have and what we don't have, putting together a plan to get there with the assessments together.
Well, thanks everybody for your comments. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go on to, like I said, these blended questions. And I'm going to address them to particular people in the group. But if someone else in the group wants to really chime in, go right ahead. This question is actually for Stephen and Linda. And Linda kind of mentioned it at the end, but I would like both Stephen and Linda to sort of amplify it based on this question. So the question is, what can we do now? How can we prepare for the future? Stephen, Linda?
You go first. I've been saying for a couple of years, the more people understand the framework, the better off people will be. The easier the transition is going to be. We've thrown a lot at you today. And as I mentioned earlier, you don't need to be worried and get nervous about the size of the change. You need to realize that there's a way to do it, and it takes some time. So the first thing I would say is, get together within your school. I've been asked a lot, how did you prepare the writers to do the writing? And Joe mentioned this earlier. We spent a lot of time just on the practices. Because in the framework they didn't do the progression of the practices. That was something the writers had to do. And it was, I don't even know how many iterations we have. I think I quit counting after like 78, 79. And it took forever. But I really feel like the reason why you see consistency in the document now is because we really went through that. So, and understand, we didn't just have hypothetical conversations. Joe came in one of our sessions, for instance, and did a modeling activity with the writers, where they talked about what is model, how do you fix a model, what does a model look like. We did the same thing with cross-cutting concepts eventually. But what you can do right now is you can start really having rich conversations around those appendices about practices. Cross-cutting concepts, I think, are a great next step. But then also, just get immersed in the standards themselves. The more you know, the better off you'll be. And I think the more you'll actually see the connections. Now, I used an example in one of the sessions a little while ago. You know, as a chemistry teacher, it was a big deal for me, for my kids to know that elements heavier than helium come from stars. You won't find that in the physical science standards. That's actually in the earth science standards. You actually find things about some solutions in the life science standards that are applicable to, say, chemistry. But the more you get into those standards, the more you'll be prepared to make that transition. So, and then finally, the other part I would say is pick one thing for next year. One thing that you think you can do a really nice job of. And apply the practices, apply the cross-cutting concepts to that one thing. Don't try to recast your whole year. Find the one thing that you think you can do well. If your whole department needs to do that, then they all do it together. If you want to pick it off and say, well, you know what, I really want to focus on explanations, you focus on investigations. And build that community around the practices. I think those are things you can do right now, immediately. Get involved in things like MSTA and what they're going to be providing, what the REISs are going to be providing, and what NSTA is providing for professional development. But I really do think the linchpin is about those practices.
I think the first thing I would say is even if the standards were adopted today, we would not expect you to go much further than what Stephen said in the next year anyway, because it's getting to know and understand the standards and what they contain and what it means for your everyday work before you can even delve into it and start applying it. If I were to expand on something Stephen said, I would suggest that you take your favorite unit, you go look at the practices, and you look at any standards that may apply in that unit and say to yourself, so how would I change it next year, knowing that this is what's in the pipeline? What would I do differently with this unit? How would I make it feel more real to my students? I might even talk to my math colleagues, my social studies colleagues, and I'm going to guess your English language arts folks as well, and say, so how could we integrate this unit? How might we take all of this, and I'm going to use the practices as my linchpin this next year for learning about things. How might we bring in some writing, some math, and what's going on in the social atmosphere that caused some of these things to happen, or why is this an important thing for us to study? You pick your topic. But doing that with just one unit would help you become much more familiar with what's inside all of this and put you in a much better position to move forward once we have something actually adopted. And that would be the first step anyway, understanding what's inside.
Okay, we had a host of questions that had to do with pathways for middle school and high school, like what's the best pathway for these things. So this is actually a question for Sue, but I think Robby might want to chime in as well, since you just had a session on it. So the question is what pathway will we be taking? I guess that's Michigan. What pathway will Michigan take in middle school and in high school?
I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to go to the model course pathway breakout in the last session, but I'm sure you learned a lot there. But for the rest of you who didn't, we did a lot of work. There will be an Appendix K coming out that kind of is an update of what was Appendix J in the January version. And so that'll be a good resource. In your packet, you have a nice resource right at the back in your breakout handouts that is the Michigan planning team or the Michigan internal review team's work in that area. But you know, we are a local control state, you're well aware of that. The standards were purposely written in gray bands at middle school and without describing required sequence in high school or even course structure for high school on purpose. And that's to allow us to find different ways to be innovative and to implement the standards. there's no question that our teachers have expressed a huge support for having MDE define what happens in 6, what happens in 7, what happens in 8. But nobody has the same definition of what they want. And so there's a lot of opportunity to try things, to think about ways that make the most sense, and to advocate for those. But I would suggest that you wouldn't want to make any decisions about being like a firm decision until we have some idea of what kind of assessment we're going to have and what are the opportunities to work with some of our partners in some sort of a larger scale assessment opportunity. And decisions that are made for those reasons are going to help us decide what we want to do to teach, especially since we will want to prepare for whatever assessment. So while you're deciding to get to really know the standards and what seems to work best for building capacity and actually paying attention to these progressions and building the prior knowledge that students need to do whatever comes next, you'll be able to have a voice in that discussion when it's time to decide if we do something more than just, you know, everybody's free to do it however they want to. And so you really don't even have a seat at the table until you get to know the standards and you can advocate for the power of doing it a certain way. So I'd suggest let's go for it and let's try, as we've said, a little bit here, a little bit there, and be able to be part of that conversation when it's time.
The only thing I want to add to that from MSTA's perspective is just to reiterate the fact that we do have local control. With MSTA, we made it a point that our voices were heard at the table. And I think that's what's really nice about what we are seeing about the next generation standards. They do reflect the voice of Michigan educators, business and industry, who really shared what they felt those standards needed. In addition to that, as a local community, district, etc., I would encourage you to make decisions based on what your community needs. And one of my recommendations would be to look at your data. What does the data for your students tell you that your children need? How are you going to help them to be more successful and lifelong learners? What are the needs of your community, your business and industries, and how can you work together with organizing your science programming so that it meets the needs of your area?
We also had a number of questions on the adoption process. So this is a question for Linda, and the question is, will there be a transition plan and a timeline?
The actual adoption process or the implementation process?
Well, there was actually two questions, but I thought she answered the first one. The first question is, what is the timeline for Michigan adoption? And if it is adopted, then will there be a transition plan and a timeline for doing that?
So as I said earlier, the adoption, the timeline for the adoption is dependent on us getting some information and then being able to analyze it and put together some answers for the stakeholders at the levels of making adoptions, so the state board and leadership in the department, some of the legislature. So that'd be step one, and getting to our adoption. Secondly, once it's adopted, a lot of this team that you see up here and some others will put together a timeline, and anything I've ever heard about implementation for this group of standards has been in a number of years, not in a number of months. And the need to help people have the skills necessary to be able to integrate the practices so that you can have an integrated approach to science. And that will take some time. So 3 years, 4 years won't surprise us, but we'll all be working hard on that whole process, and we will publish it well in advance. Andy needs us to get real focused on that once we have an adoption, because his ability to respond depends on what that timeline looks like too. So we'll be looking to Andy and his team for what they need from us to make it work smoothly. So you're not getting, oh, this year we're testing on this, and next year, oops, sorry, it's something else, and oh, by the way, test both of them this year, or teach both of them this year. So we need a smooth transition through all of those issues. No real number there, Joe, but we are aware that we have to think about that.
And speaking of Andy, this is a question for Andy. What is the timeline for full implementation with respect to the assessment? I know you mentioned a little bit about assessment to begin with, but I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about what would be that timeline.
I can try, but
The short answer is, asking me, like, are we going to have the MEP test next year, right? So what?
Right,
I think people
right.
are
Well,
curious.
you know, what we do know is what we have currently built. You know, so in the fall of 13 here, we're gonna have a science meat test, we're gonna have science MME test, just like we know it. Until you hear otherwise from us, we need to assume the assessments are all based on GLCEs and HSCEs, because that's what we have. As far as when we get into our tests, having any piece of the next generation science standards in it is really unknown at this point. And you know, that plays to Linda's comment there that step one is we need to adopt these. And then, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to need to spend some serious time working together with, you know, this group of people here at the table and lots of you folks, spending some time looking at, you know, where are there some overlaps or connections between what we have been using and the next generation science standards, so we can get an idea of, you know, what do we have in our cupboard assessment-wise that, you know, could still be used or not used. So, you know, we really don't know. But again, it's a matter of years, not months. There's not going to be anything drastically changed next school year or even the year after that. So we're really looking beyond that 14-15 school year when we're going to start talking assessment to NGSS.
Joe, if I could add to that, I think the model that Andy's shop used for putting together the change from the standards to Common Core State standards was one where we published well in advance what years, what standards would change and where they could expect to find them. And it's no secret that both the folks in BA and OEII share some responsibility for the rescoring that's going on. And that's because we had to identify and failed to identify some standards that should not have been counted in the scoring for this year. And so we will be doing that kind of thing, identifying where some years we might still test it, but we won't be scoring it. And so those are kind of the procedures we go through in order to have a seamless or almost seamless transition for all of you and try and figure out where things are important in your classrooms. Is that fair?
This is a question for Robby and Larry. And the question, there's actually two questions. It's how can teachers gain support from administrators? And how can administrators support teachers?
I think it is important to know that every plan that we've talked about as far as providing professional development from the network perspective, even plans talking with Great for STEM with Joe and his folks, have included an administrative academy. And I think it's real important, above and beyond any other changes we've ever made in science before, that our building principles be a critical part of this changeover. Our building principals really need to be the instructional leader in this case. So it's important that they know, as well as the teachers know, what this next generation science standards, the changes that are going to happen because of it.
The other pieces, and I agree with Larry, and the other pieces to it as well, we could and will put together an administrative strand or a series of workshops for administrators that at MSTA State Conference. In addition to that, the first talking, of course, begins with you. And as you talk to your building administrator and say, in what ways might we make some of this work? What do you need? How can we help you? How can you help us? How can we do this together? And then come to, and if there's resources you need, if there's additional, once we know what they need, then we can design things that are really intentional. That's what's really nice about having this gift of time.
This is a question for Stephen. And it's, are there plans for public relation information? And also, what about educative materials for us? What are you guys going to provide?
You're on your own. I'm just kidding. The biggest thing that we have to do is you know, the whole Winnebago joke earlier today. You know, there's just always going to be half truths. There's going to be half of what people hear. And so we already have started developing materials that we've been supporting MDE throughout this whole process with, you know, we have conference calls before we would have releases and say, well, here's what changed. You know, many of you saw that, especially the public relations, you saw how things changed from one thing to the other. But now that we are actually past development and supporting adoption, we have a staff of folks at Achieve that, and we also work with a PR firm called Whitmire to begin the work of developing additional materials that can be used by lots of different people for lots of different audiences. Obviously, at the state level, there's a lot of work around the stakeholders and who needs to know what do you need to tell businesses versus what do you tell legislators. We'll leave it at that. How do you navigate that? But all the way down to the school level, where you're going to have to, your stakeholders become parents, and your stakeholders become the local businesses. So we are going to stand ready to support any state that adopts the standards with PR materials and a kind of a toolkit that will help get the message out. Because, like I mentioned in my session this morning, I already hear people saying, oh, there's no research behind these, and there's, yeah, there is. You just actually have to read something to know. And unfortunately, we're not a country who actually believes in reading accurate materials as opposed to just listening to what somebody told me about things. I think that's actually a literacy common core standard, that we actually are critically reviewing materials. So we are going to stand ready to help on that.
This is a question for Megan. She sort of addressed it a little bit. Oh.
Actually, one more thing real quick, if you don't mind, Joe, sorry. The other part is that, because I've had a couple people kind of ask this question today, and it's been now, the question's been asked of me since April 9th. I did not get fired April 9th. I still have a job just because the standards are finished. And now we move into this next phase. So you will also see that the NGSS site is not finished. You will continue to see additional pathways added. You're going to see additional tools added. For instance, a rubric that we're working on with NSTA to establish quality, a definition of quality for instructional units. Joe and Melanie aren't finished because they're going to have to help us with developing some model tasks and model frameworks that people can see how this will look in the classroom. And all of those I consider PR materials as well. Sorry, Joe.
Now I'm going to go on to Megan. So you partially answered this, but I thought you could expand it a little bit. So there was a number of questions that came up with, will we have examples of what this looks like in the classroom? What modeling looks like, what it means to take part in argumentation, constructing explanation. So what does this look like in the classroom, including any kind of student work? So what can you tell us about that?
Yes. NSTA has
I'll
a lot.
change that. What kind of examples
Yes.
do we have?
Well, there are some examples out there already. Like I was saying, NSTA has a learning center that has, they've done some extensive work on what the practices look like. And those are quite good and free, available to you right now. Like I did mention earlier, we have been selected as one of the pilot states to be part of the NGSS project, and in that work there are video examples of what the science classroom looks like, mostly based around science talk and how to get those types of conversations going in your classroom so that you can engage in argument and reasoning and all these other parts that we want to look at. As part of that project, they do pull in examples of student work as well, and they have conversations around that. So through that project, through the collaborations with the Math Science Network, MSTA, Michigan STEM Partnership, we are looking at how to best align all of our resources that we currently have in our state, so that we're working to the strengths of all of those organizations. And I think that's one of the nice things that this adoption and implementation process is giving us, is really aligning those resources and helping everybody work towards the same vision.
I think Larry wants to chime in.
I just wanted to let you know one of the threads of discussion that we've had with our partners through the network. We had such success when the Glickies and the Huskies were out with a companion document. We had so many of the teachers tell us how much they really, really appreciated that document. So we have been discussing perhaps the creation of a companion document that will accompany the next generation science standards. That's at least been part of the discussion.
Okay, so the next question is for Andy and Robby. And this is, how will teachers be involved in the process of developing the assessments, both formative and summative?
Well, I can speak first. You know, at least for, from the standpoint of our MEP and MME tests and our interim assessments, you know, one of the things we, are really proud of in the assessment office is that we really use 100% educator effort in all of our item development processes, from, the initial crafting of our items to reviewing them and looking at data coming back from an initial field test of these items. And certainly that's going to continue on with the next generation science standards, if adopted, that we're going to bring educators in like we normally do and plug them into that effort. And certainly before that, there may be opportunities where our office is going to be looking for feedback and input from science educators in the field to see how we might want to reshape our item designs or look into where we want to take our assessment moving forward.
From our perspective, we will also be running a number of sessions on assessment, both formative and summative assessment, what that looks like. How do you create the rubrics, and then making them a lot of the work available either on a variety of websites for use by all teachers, but also then writing journal articles and newsletter articles that are also helpful for you to be able to use with your schools in a variety of settings.
This is a question for Megan and Linda. Is what are the implications for teacher certification?
We've been working on all areas of teacher certification over the last year and a half at the request of Mike Flanagan, who wanted to see us begin to provide good education for those who are aspiring to become teachers in the field. I think that the implications are multiple, and I'm so glad that Joe's standing there, because it goes back to those institutions that need to have their scientists get together with their folks who work on pedagogy and come together on what is a common understanding of what we need to see happening. It could have an impact on how we do things in colleges and universities as well. Heaven forbid, but it could have an impact. So you've heard this a lot from us. It's under advisement, it's under study. Anytime we get the new standards, we go back to the institutions that provide us with the teachers in this state and say, here's what we're expecting out of the teachers. What can you do to have them ready? Because we'd like to have them come out ready rather than having them to be retrained once they get into the field.
And I would just like to add to that you saw quite a few examples today of the planning or the thought that would go into providing that learning progression for just one or a bundled set of performance expectations. And that takes quite a bit of content knowledge and expertise, and that isn't going to come just from one person, most likely. And so I think when we're thinking about certifications, we can't get too narrow and focused, but we can't get too broad either, that we lose some of that content expertise. So part of that is making sure that you have kind of a well-rounded instructional team when planning these learning performances, so that you can provide a really rich learning experience for your students.
So I still have some questions that aren't answered, and I got some really interesting new ones while we're just before the session, but we're not going to get to them because of time. It's been a long day. I actually want to thank our panel members for responding, so thank you very much. I do want you to know that we, Sue, and a number of us are going to try to answer these questions, all the questions, and so there'll be a more thorough set, and they will be posted on a website, so there will be a series of answers, is that correct? So that you should look to that. You should also look for all the materials on the website. We told you this morning how you can get access to it. And I also want to thank all of you for sticking around all day, and I hope that you found the day profitable, and as we move forward in trying to move our state forward as far as student understanding of science. So thank you for coming, and I hope you had a profitable day.